The Republic is a book written by Plato about conversations with Aristotle, and very, very good read. I highly recommend you get this book either as an audiobook just to listen to it, or as a real book to read and underline. There's so much in there, and the the way it's written, it still makes perfect sense today. It just shows not just the ideas itself, but that human nature has changed so little over the last 2,500 years. I was blown away listening to this book. So let's go over some of the ideas in here. So first, they start off pretty light, talking about justice and what it means to be a good person, and what are the best types of government. Um, so I'll run through a couple of ideas, the things that stood out to me in the book that I took some notes on. But just so you know, this is such a small percentage of what's actually in there. There's 11 books, and if the things I say here are interesting to you, I would then go get the book yourself. All right. So the first thing is, Aristotle is talking with an old friend who's old. He hasn't seen in a while, and he asks his friend, like, "Hey, what is the greatest benefit to all your wealth in old age?" And this might be good advice for anyone to take, but for anyone to consider. But he says that the greatest benefit of wealth when you're old is just that you get a lot of peace, because you know throughout your entire life you never wronged anyone, you didn't need to steal from anyone, and you're not in debt to anyone. So you can just live peacefully without any fear or any anxiety about sins of the past or anything like that. So interesting, not the luxuries, I suppose, of wealth, but just the peace and calm it can bring. That if you were, as Aristotle says, an evil rich person, you don't get that peace, because no matter how much money you have, if you've wronged a lot of people, that will haunt you until your dying day. They also talk about justice and say, well, is justice really a great idea? Like, is justice the best thing ever that keeps us all good people, or is it just the interests of the powerful? And, they ask questions like, well, maybe the unjust get a lot of benefits. Maybe they always win in contracts because they can just break the contract. They pay less taxes. They steal a lot of things because a lot of things are easy to be stolen. And in the end, because they have more resources, the unjust can make bigger sacrifices to the gods and get more benefits in the afterlife as well. The friends of the unjust, he can throw a party for them, so they also win in a sense. And if an unjust person is rich, well, people still respect him, same as today. And interesting things to think about. But one of the main ideas that Aristotle talks about is that in each person we have these good and bad parts. We have the reasoning, thoughtful parts, the logical parts, and then we have these more animal beings, which is the things we want to do, even if they're wrong. And his point is that if you don't have justice inside of you as well as outside, then maybe you benefit from being lawless outside, but at the same time you have this lawlessness inside of you where you're actually controlled by these lesser desires for all the whatever, and maybe you want to eat too much, or maybe you want to drink too much and you just can't control it. And so he basically, that's one of his main arguments here, is that the same way that a bad king might be quite cruel to his subjects, maybe a tyrant might be quite cruel, you end up doing the same thing inside of yourself if you don't have control of the bad parts, using the good parts, and the bad parts of you end up tyrannizing yourself. So that's one of his main arguments throughout the book, is that yes, maybe the unjust win some things, but what are they really losing in the long term by not having control over the bad parts of themselves? They also talk about justice and say, well, what is the popular view of justice? And this was interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, and it's a very interesting idea, is that basically they say that there's two different realities that most people would agree to. And that's either that everyone is kind of allowed to be unjust, or we all try to be just and fair and have some kind of society together. And that no one really likes being forced to be just and fair, but people realize that, well, if I'm unjust and I'm quite cruel, then other people will also be allowed to do the same to me. And that basically justice is like the lesser of two evils, because sometimes it's very annoying to always have to be just yourself, but then you say, well, that's better because then everyone else has to be just with me too. So a very interesting idea brought up there is, are people just because they really know it's good and because they shy away from being unjust, or is it just that they shy away from injustice only because they know that injustice might come back to bite them? If they're unjust, others might be the same to them. So one thing, because Aristotle and Plato were philosophers, it brought up this idea that, the uselessness of the best philosophers. And they kind of say this is actually the best philosophers are necessarily useless people. And they describe it, though, in that if a philosopher really wanted to be extremely useful, he would probably do something like go into politics or seek power. But then that makes him actually a worse philosopher, because now he's just materialistic, looking out for himself. He doesn't teach the truth. He'll just say whatever he needs to become a powerful politician. And they describe it just how, like a doctor, when no one seeks him out, he's useless. But when you're sick, you need to go seek the useless doctor in order to be healed, in order to get some help. And he also describes this example of a captain, a ship's captain, saying that, the best captain is not the one who's fighting to take control of the ship and to steer the ship and control the rigging and control the steering wheel and all that. But the best captain might be the one who's just quietly looking at the stars, who understands the seasons, understands where they actually are, and not the one who is trying to take control, like, for example, a smart politician or someone who's looking for that power. All right, so the next thing Aristotle talks about, and again, there's a lot more in this book, but he talks about the 5 forms of government that he's looked at and which one he thinks is the best. And he ranks them from best to worst. Royalty would be like a philosopher king, who's basically a good king. Timocracy, oligarchy, and then, interestingly enough, at the bottom, democracy, and then tyranny. And, of course, ranking democracy so low is quite interesting. So that was, he ranks democracy so low basically because it's a lack of law and order. Like freedom, liberty, do whatever you want, whenever you want. Basically, he says that it's just a lack of order. It's kind of random. You might have a lot of different interests and a lot of different things you can do. And there's a lot of beautiful things, like all the different cultures of the world and whatnot are allowed and all these things. And he describes those as good. Like, it's kind of like a very beautiful shirt with lots of different gems on it. But at the same time, there's these shifts in even language that people believe. So, for example, anarchy becomes liberty, and wastefulness becomes generosity, and impudence, basically stupidity, becomes courage, and moderation becomes stingy, and then shame is also just foolish. So, and then he basically describes how in this way, Democrats have quite a different nature from someone who is in a more, I suppose, normal society where you have some rulers at the top who are making a lot of decisions. And very interestingly, as he says, that it's actually this belief in total freedom that leads to tyranny. where the tyrant says, yes, I can do whatever I want anytime, and then he becomes a very, very cruel and oppressive leader. And basically his point is that tyranny comes directly from democracy, from the beliefs of democracy. But also, of course, he does put tyranny at the bottom, and he basically says that's because when you have this very cruel nature, you end up trapping yourself. You end up being trapped by the people around you because, well, you don't feel safe to travel outside your own home. You always need bodyguards. You don't want to leave the country because you feel like you're going to get stabbed. So basically he does say tyranny is quite a bad thing, but also he describes the internal mind of the tyrant, where internally as well, the worst parts of the tyrant's mind are constantly attacking and controlling the best parts of his mind: the logic, the reason, the justice, the fairness. And I think we'd all agree with that, but it was so interesting, his connection tying democracy so close to tyranny, compared to those who rule over themselves, who are the best. So a couple of his things he says are, the best and the most just are the happiness because they reign over themselves. The worst and the unjust are the most miserable, tyrannizing themselves, and if they're the king of a republic, the republic. The good in us tames the wild. The good parts should reign over the wild, and people who cannot reign over their wild parts should be reigned by the good parts of others. And that's where he talks about philosopher king leading the republic would be the best, but also very difficult to find a philosopher king back in his time or in our current time. And one of the last things he talks about kind of gets quite dramatic at the end, but he talks about, very interesting, this is 400 BC, before Christ, but Aristotle talks about a very similar idea to heaven and hell, where people get judged and they either go to heaven for 1,000 years or they go to hell for 1,000 years. And it was interesting, the last story is him talking about after 1,000 years in either heaven and hell, people can pick their next life. And so they all draw lots to see who will pick first, but there's a whole bunch of lives on the ground, I guess pieces of paper, the stories of the life. And he talks about how one person drew the first lot, so he could pick first out of all the lives. And so, without thinking too much, he ran over to the lot of the most powerful person in the world, the story of the most powerful king in the world, and he immediately grabs it and says, "This is mine," without carefully reading. And it's a tyrant, he's very cruel, and in the end, this tyrant ends up eating his own children. And then the other people pick their lives, and the wise people, they take the time to choose carefully. And this is what was interesting, is according to this story, everyone is told that whatever lot you draw, whether it's the first or the last, you should be careful which life you're going to pick. And that even if you draw the last lot, you're the last person to pick a life, you can still pick carefully and pick wisely and pick well. And some people choose to come back as animals, maybe like a beautiful swan, or there's a jester who chooses to come back as a monkey. There's a warrior who chooses to come back as a lion. But the last person to pick, who has the last lot out of everyone, looks very, very carefully, and he just finds the life of a common private citizen, not a powerful politician, just someone who lived well. And the moral of the story is that he was one of the wisest to pick, even though he was the last, because there are many, many lives to pick from. But even though he was the last to pick his life, he still picked well. Just picking, even coming back as a normal private citizen, just choosing carefully a life Well, chosen on purpose, chosen wisely. And I think this is a metaphor to give us all something to think about, even though we're not picking before our own birth. We all can make this choice, no matter your lots, whether you're the last to pick or the first to pick. But it kind of brought chills down my spine to think that, you think it's an amazing thing to be able to pick your life, but we all can make these decisions ourselves. And we can all pick greedily and too quickly, thoughtlessly, or we can pick carefully and wisely.